Before we begin, if you find yourself drifting into the strange and somber world of nightfall notions, consider subscribing. There are many more uneventful tragedies and absurd historical inconveniences waiting for you here. Tonight we continue with Chapter 1. The year the world held its breath, where even the smallest bodily function could spell doom. The year was 1348. And the world had developed a sudden, profound hatred for sneezing. It wasn't the sound, though a poorly timed achoo in a quiet church could earn you some scowls, but the implications. A sneeze was no longer just a sneeze. It was a herald, a little biological trumpet announcing, "Hello everyone, I might be bringing death to supper." Europe had become a place where people walked sideways in the streets, not just to avoid the piles of waste, though that was reason enough, but to avoid the breath of others. Breathing, as it turned out, had become a suspicious activity. If you coughed, people took 2 large steps back. If you sneezed, they might just flee entirely, abandoning their market baskets, their children, their dignity. It was a time of great innovation in personal space. The Black Death didn't care about personal space, of course. It was the worst kind of guest, uninvited, unstoppable, and with a habit of overstaying its welcome. By 1348, it had settled in like a particularly malevolent fog, drifting from town to town, house to house, lung to lung. It didn't matter if you were rich or poor, pious or wicked. The plague was an equal opportunity destroyer, though it did seem to have a fondness for densely populated areas, where it could really stretch its legs. Doctors, those poor, baffled men, strutted around in beaked masks filled with herbs, convinced that bad air, miasma, was the culprit. They looked like nightmarish birds, pecking at the edges of society, utterly useless. Their prescriptions ranged from the benign, burning nice-smelling things, to the outright harmful, leeches, always leeches. Meanwhile, the real culprits, fleas, rats, and the general lack of hygiene, went about their business unbothered. In the midst of this, imagine being a perfectly healthy person with allergies. One moment you're enjoying a stroll, the next, a row bit of pollen ambushes your nose. You sneeze. A single, innocent sneeze. And just like that, you're a pariah. Neighbors cross themselves. Lovers clutch their handkerchiefs to their faces like makeshift armor. The local priest eyes you with a mix of pity and terror, already mentally drafting your eulogy. The streets of cities like Florence or London were eerily quiet, save for the occasional wail of grief or the rasping cough of someone who definitely wasn't long for this world. Markets that once buzzed with haggling and laughter now operated with the grim efficiency of a skeleton crew. People bartered with coins they'd soaked in vinegar, as if money itself could be purified. Some took to carrying posies or spices in their pockets, little charms against the inevitable. And then there were the flagellants. Oh, the flagellants. These zealous wanderers took to the roads, whipping themselves raw in public displays of penitence, convinced that God's wrath could be appeased with enough self-inflicted pain. They moved in eerie processions, their chants rising like a dirge, their backs a canvas of blood and devotion. Townsfolk watched with a mix of awe and horror, unsure if these men were holy, or just hastening the spread of disease with their open wounds and shared fervor. Amid all this, the sneeze became a social curse. A man might sneeze at his breakfast and find his family recoiling as if he'd drawn a sword. A mother might stifle a sneeze into her sleeve, only to catch her children edging toward the door. Even the act of blessing someone after a sneeze, "God bless you," took on a desperate, superstitious edge. It wasn't just courtesy anymore, it was a plea. And so, the world held its breath. Not literally, of course. People still had to breathe, even if they did it nervously, shallowly, as if testing the air for poison. But metaphorically, the collective inhale of a continent, waiting for the next wave of death, was palpable. Life became a series of small calculations. Was that ache just fatigue, or the first sign of the end? Was that cough from the damp, or from something far worse? And above all, I don't sneeze in public unless you want to be treated like a walking corpse. It was a bad time to have a cold. A worse time to have a flair for the dramatic. But the absolute worst time, without question, to sneeze. Chapter 2. The anatomy of a sneeze. To understand why a sneeze could ruin your life in 1348, one must first understand how medieval minds interpreted the act of sneezing. Today we know it as an involuntary explosion of air, a biological hiccup caused by irritated nasal passages. But in the 14th century, a sneeze was not just a sneeze, it was an omen, a betrayal of the body, a tiny apocalypse bursting forth from your face. The medieval theory of sneezing was, like most medieval theories, equal parts fascinating and absurd. Scholars of the time believed that the human body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and any imbalance could lead to illness. A sneeze, therefore, was not just a reflex. It was a violent expulsion of vital spirits, a sudden rupture in the delicate equilibrium of the body. Some even claimed it was the soul itself trying to escape, thrust outward by an internal rebellion. This was bad news in a world already convinced that the Black Death was divine punishment. If a sneeze was the body's desperate attempt to rid itself of corruption, then what did it say about the sneezer? Were they already infected? Were they moments away from collapsing in a feverish heap? Or worse, were they the unwitting heralds of death, spraying pestilence into the air with every convulsive blast? Doctors of the era, armed with little more than guesswork and a stubborn refusal to admit they had no idea what they were doing, theorized that sneezing spread disease through bad air. This was not entirely incorrect. Plague did spread through respiratory droplets, but their reasoning was spectacularly off the mark. They believed the air itself was cursed, that miasma, a fancy word for smelly, probably evil air, carried the sickness, and that sneezing was simply the body's way of ejecting the poison. This led to some truly bizarre recommendations. Physicians advised covering one's mouth during a sneeze, not to protect others, but to prevent the bad air from escaping and infecting yourself again. Some suggested holding in sneezes entirely, as if the human body were a poorly constructed barrel, and suppressing a sneeze was the same as plugging a leak. Unsurprisingly, this resulted in a lot of headaches, popped blood vessels, and at least one recorded incident of a man fainting in church after trying to stifle a particularly violent sneeze. The church, never one to miss an opportunity to weigh in on bodily functions, had its own interpretations. Some clergy declared that sneezing was a sign of demonic influence, that the forceful expulsion of air was the body's attempt to rid itself of evil spirits. This led to the charming practice of blessing sneezers, not out of kindness, but as a preemptive strike against the supernatural. The phrase, "God bless you," took on a defensive edge, less a polite courtesy and more a spiritual shield. Then there were the folk remedies. If you sneezed 3 times in a row, it meant someone was gossiping about you. If you sneezed before breakfast, you would have bad luck all day. If you sneezed while walking backward, you were either a witch or just terrible at spatial awareness. People carried cloves of garlic, not just to ward off vampires, though that was a bonus, but because the strong smell was thought to prevent sneezing. Some even wore little bags of herbs around their necks, which did nothing for the plague but did make them smell like a roast dinner. The worst part, sneezing was, and still is, a completely normal bodily function. People sneezed when dust got up their noses. They sneezed when they walked through a sunbeam after hours in a dimly lit room. They sneezed when they thought too hard about pepper. But in 1348, every sneeze was suspect. A single yakum could turn a man into a social leper, a walking time bomb of contagion. This paranoia reached its peak in public spaces. A sneeze in a crowded market could cause a ripple of panic, a sudden clearing of space around the offender. Taverns ejected sneezing patrons under the assumption that they were moments away from collapsing into their ale. Even in households, a sneeze could earn you a side-eye from your own family, their expressions flickering between concern and "Hey, please, don't die in the kitchen." And yet, despite all this fear, people still sneeze. Because bodies, as it turns out, do not care about historical context. They do not pause to consider the social ramifications of an itch in the nose. They simply react, explosively, inconveniently, with no regard for the fact that you are now being stared at like a condemned criminal. So imagine, if you will, the sheer horror of living in a time when something as mundane as a sneeze could make you an outcast. When every tickle in your nose carried the weight of potential doom. When the simple act of breathing, of existing, could mark you for death in the eyes of your neighbors. It was, in short, a very bad time to have allergies. Chapter 3. Plague Doctors and Their Beaky Masks. If the year 1348 had a mascot, it would have been the Plague Doctor, a figure so absurdly grim he looked like Death's overzealous accountant. Cloaked in black from head to toe, face obscured by a grotesque, bird-like mask, these men strode through the streets like nightmares made flesh, their very presence a whispered admission that things had gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. The outfit was, in theory, protective. The long waxed coat was meant to repel fluids, and presumably the stares of horrified onlookers. The gloves were thick enough to prevent skin contact with the infected, though they also made it nearly impossible to hold a quill, let alone perform any meaningful medical procedures. Then there were the boots, sturdy, knee-high, and utterly useless against fleas, which were the actual vectors of the disease. But the crowning glory, the pièce de résistance of this macabre ensemble, was the mask. Ah, the mask. A leather contraption with round glass eyes and a long curved beak. It made its wearer look like a crow who had just been told very upsetting news. The beak wasn't just for dramatic flair, though it certainly had plenty of that. It was a primitive filter stuffed with aromatic herbs like lavender, mint, and cloves. The logic was sound in the most medieval way possible. If bad smells caused disease, then good smells must repel it. Never mind that the plague wasn't spread by odors, or that the herbs did nothing to stop the actual bacteria. The important thing was that the Dr. G felt protected, even as he leaned over another patient who was definitely not going to make it. These beaked spectacles were not, as one might assume, the product of some ancient, secret medical tradition. They were dreamed up by physicians who had run out of ideas and were now just throwing things at the wall to see what stuck. The design was partially inspired by the masks worn by perfumers, who needed to avoid being overwhelmed by strong scents. Someone, somewhere, decided that if it worked for rosewater, it would work for the Black Death. And thus the Plague Doctor mask was born, a fashion statement that screamed, "I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm doing it with confidence." The Plague Doctor's job was simple in theory and impossible in practice. Treat the sick. But treat was a generous term. In reality, their methods ranged from the useless to the actively harmful. Bloodletting was a favorite, because nothing says cure like draining a dying man of what little strength he had left. Leashes were applied with a kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for tax collection. Some doctors prescribed potions of crushed emeralds or powdered unicorn horn, which was, unsurprisingly, always in short supply. Others insisted that the patient be rubbed with the fat of a freshly killed snake, a remedy that did wonders for the local snake population but very little for the plague. And then there was the eye smoking. Not the patient, though given the desperation, that might have been next, but the doctor himself. Many plague doctors carried a small incense burner or a smoldering sponge in their beaks, filling the air around them with thick, pungent smoke. The idea was that the fumes would purify the air, creating a protective barrier between the doctor and the miasma. In reality, it just made the already unsettling figure appear to be perpetually on fire, trailing smoke like a walking, coughing chimney. What's remarkable is that, despite the total lack of effectiveness, the costume worked in one crucial way. It terrified people. The sight of a plague doctor approaching your door was enough to make even the bravest soul reconsider their life choices. Children hid. Grown men crossed themselves. Dogs barked incessantly, as if trying to warn humanity about the mistake it had made. And in a strange way, this fear was useful. The plague doctor wasn't just a healer. He was a walking reminder that death was near, that rules had to be followed, that you did not want to end up on his list. Of course, the irony was that plague doctors died just as often as anyone else. The herbs did nothing. The coat did nothing. The mask, for all its menacing elegance, did nothing. They succumbed to the same disease they were pretending to understand, their beaks pointing skyward as they took their last herb-scented breaths. But for a brief, darkly comic moment in history, they strutted through the streets like avian grim reapers, their presence a perfect encapsulation of the era's desperation. A man dressed as a bird, waving a stick at death, and hoping for the best. Chapter 4. The sneeze that started a panic. It began, as most disasters do, with something small. A tickle. An itch. A faint, fluttering sensation deep in the nasal passages of one Henri Dubois, a perfectly healthy onion merchant who had never once considered his own sneezes to be a matter of public concern. That changed on the morning of April 17th, 38, in the crowded marketplace of Provins, Brandstad. The day had started normally enough. Farmers hawked their wares. Housewives haggled over the price of salt. Children darted between stalls with sticky fingers and sticky futures. The air smelled of bread, dung, and the ever-present tang of fear that had lingered since the first whispers of plague reached the town. People moved carefully, avoiding unnecessary contact, as if the very air between them might suddenly turn hostile. Then Henri sneezed. It wasn't even a particularly dramatic sneeze. Not one of those thunderous, full-bodied eruptions that startles birds from trees. No, this was a modest, workmanlike sneeze. A quick, sharp waku that in any other year would have warranted nothing more than a polite ha-tease so high from whoever happened to be standing nearby. But this was not any other year. This was 1348. And in 1348, a sneeze was not just a sneeze. It was a confession. A woman carrying a basket of eggs was the first to react. Her head snapped toward Henri with the speed of someone who had just heard the click of a crossbow being loaded. Her eyes widened. Her grip on the basket tightened. And then, without a word, she took 3 rapid steps backward, directly into a display of pottery. The crash of breaking clay was the spark that lit the powder keg. Heads turned. Voices rose. A man near the cheese stall pointed at Henri and shouted something that might have been "Oi plague" or possibly "I garlic." But the exact word didn't matter. The tone was enough. The crowd rippled, people recoiling as if Henri had just unsheathed a sword. A space cleared around him, 5 feet of empty ground marking him as unclean. Henri, still holding an onion in one hand, blinked. It was just a sneeze, he said, but his words were swallowed by the rising tide of panic. A woman near the front made the sign of the cross. A child began to cry. Someone threw a turnip. Then the screaming started. It came from the back of the crowd, where a fishmonger's apprentice had just remembered a crucial fact. He, too, had sneezed yesterday. Was it the plague? Was it dust? Did it matter? In the span of a heartbeat, he went from bystander to suspect, and the crowd, already primed for hysteria, turned on him like wolves on a wounded deer. "He's got it too," someone bellowed, and just like that, the mob had a new target. What followed was not a riot so much as a grotesque dance of fear. People ran in all directions, some fleeing the sneezers, others chasing them, everyone convinced that someone nearby was patient zero. A barrel of apples overturned. A chicken, sensing its moment, made a break for freedom. The town guard arrived, took one look at the chaos, and immediately started yelling about quarantine, which only made things worse. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the marketplace was a ghost town. Stalls stood abandoned. Merchants had barricaded themselves in their homes. The only evidence of the morning's madness was a single onion trampled into the dirt, and the lingering echo of the word "I plague," whispered from door to door like a curse. As for Henri, he was fine. His sneeze had been nothing more than a reaction to the pollen that always blew in from the fields this time of year. But try telling that to the mob. By nightfall, he'd been dragged to the edge of town and locked in a shed that had once held turnips, and now held him. The first unwilling guest of Proven's brand new, entirely improvised pest house. And so the legend of the Great Market Panic of 1348 was born. Not because anyone died, no one had, at least not yet, but because it proved something terrible and true. Fear was more contagious than any disease. All it took was one sneeze, one spark, and suddenly everyone was running, screaming, pointing fingers, convinced that death was in the air. And the worst part, they weren't entirely wrong. Chapter 5. Miasma Theory. The air was evil. The medieval world operated on one fundamental principle. If something smelled bad, it was trying to kill you. This was not paranoia. This was science. Or at least what passed for science in an age when educated men debated how many angels could dance on the head of a pin while stepping over actual corpses in the streets. The theory of miasma, the belief that foul air caused disease, wasn't just medical dogma. It was an entire worldview, as unquestioned as gravity and considerably more fragrant. The logic was beautifully circular. Plague made people stink from sweat, vomit, and the general aroma of impending death. Therefore, stench must cause plague. Cities with their open sewers and rotting garbage were obviously dangerous, not because of rats and fleas, but because they smelled like a tavern's privy on a hot afternoon. When entire households died in their beds, neighbors would report a terrible smell preceding their demise, never considering that perhaps the smell was simply what happened when several people died in a small room during summer. Into this aromatic landscape came the humble sneeze, nature's little air cannon, blasting invisible corruption across rooms and market squares with alarming efficiency. Where we see a harmless reflex, medieval physicians saw a biological betrayal. Your own body was expelling pockets of corrupted air, like a wineskin squirting poison. A cough was suspicious, but a sneeze was an announcement that you were actively manufacturing bad air from your very face. The medical texts of the time treated sneezes with the seriousness we reserve for radioactive leaks. The great physician Gentile da Foligno, who ironically would later die of plague himself, wrote that sneezing forcibly expels the corrupted humors through the nostrils, and warned that bystanders might inhale the venom. This led to some truly creative interpretations of personal space. Wealthy households began installing elaborate ventilation systems, which mostly meant opening more windows and hoping for the best. Some aristocrats took to carrying scented pomanders, which they would press to their noses when in public, like olfactory force fields against the great unwashed. The church contributed its own special brand of reasoning to the miasma theory. Some theologians argued that bad air was literally the breath of demons, and that plague was God's way of punishing cities for their moral decay, which conveniently always meant other people's sins, never one's own. This led to some enterprising priests selling sanctified air in small bags, essentially just church incense in a pouch, which parishioners could sniff when venturing into suspicious neighborhoods. Whether it worked or not depended entirely on one's definition of work. The obsession with bad air reached its zenith, or nadir, with the rise of perfume prophylaxis. The wealthy drenched themselves in rosewater and lavender oil, not for vanity, but as a desperate attempt to outstink the sickness. Doctors prescribed elaborate nosegays to be worn at all times, leading to the bizarre spectacle of grown men walking around with bouquets strapped to their faces like floral gas masks. The poor, unable to afford such luxuries, resorted to hanging herbs in their doorways or burning whatever aromatic plants they could forage, filling entire neighborhoods with the scent of desperate optimism. In this climate, a simple sneeze became a social gaffe of the highest order, the medieval equivalent of pulling the pin from a grenade at a dinner party. Etiquette manuals of the time included elaborate instructions for how to sneeze safely into one's elbow, away from others, preferably into a handkerchief stuffed with herbs, though these are about as effective as telling people to avoid plague by thinking happy thoughts. The wealthy developed increasingly baroque sneezing rituals, turning a basic bodily function into a performance art of avoidance and contrition. The tragic irony was that miasma theory wasn't completely wrong, just catastrophically misplaced. The smell of death did correlate with disease, not because it caused illness, but because it indicated poor sanitation where disease vectors thrive. When physicians advised people to flee foul-smelling areas, they were accidentally giving good advice for entirely wrong reasons. The same misunderstanding applied to sneezes. While they weren't the primary vector for plague, the instinct to avoid sick people's respiratory emissions was biologically sound, if theologically justified. This collective misunderstanding reached its peak in the summer of 1348, when the city of Florence instituted the world's first recorded sneeze tax. Anyone caught sneezing in public without covering their face would be fined 3 soldi, a considerable sum meant to discourage reckless expiration of humors. Enforcement was predictably chaotic, with informants turning in neighbors over garden walls and children learning to sneeze silently into their sleeves like little biological conspirators. What no one understood was that the real danger wasn't the air itself, but what traveled through it: the fleas on rats, the bacteria in bites, the microscopic realities invisible to their eyes and noses. They were afraid of the wrong thing, like fearing shadows while standing on train tracks. The air wasn't evil, it was just air. But try telling that to a population watching their loved ones die in agony, clutching their herb-filled masks and praying the next breath wouldn't be their last. In the face of such terror, people will believe anything, even that the very wind itself has turned against them. Chapter 6. The Scapegoat Sneeze. In times of collective panic, humanity has always excelled at one particular skill: finding someone to blame. The Black Death was no different. As the bodies piled up and the world unraveled, people needed explanations more than they needed cures. And nothing made for a more convenient scapegoat than a neighbor who couldn't keep their nasal passages to themselves. The process rarely began with outright accusations. It started with looks. The sidelong glances at market stalls when old Marguerite the midwife sneezed into her shawl. The subtle shifting of bodies in church pews when young Thomas the tanner's son erupted in a fit of sneezes during Vespers. These were the warning signs, the quiet, creeping suspicion that perhaps this person's bodily functions were slightly more sinister than most. By autumn of 1348, sneezing had become probable cause for interrogation across Europe. In Germany, town councils instituted sneeze watches, groups of concerned citizens who patrolled the streets listening for suspicious nasal activity. In England, a man in York was fined for reckless expiration after sneezing near the mayor's house. France saw the rise of plague spotters, self-appointed guardians of public health who would mark the doors of serial sneezers with white chalk, transforming an involuntary reflex into a scarlet letter made of limestone. The accusations followed predictable patterns. First came the whispers. "Did you hear? Jean sneezed 3 times yesterday, and today his wife is abed with fever." Then the pattern-seeking. "Marie always sneezes when passing my house, and now my chickens have died." Finally, the outright condemnation. "We must have done something to deserve this." Because in the medieval mind, suffering was never random. It was always someone's fault. Witchcraft accusations flourished in this atmosphere. A sneeze at the wrong moment could land you in front of a magistrate explaining why you chose to expel air so violently near Widow Bawden's prize pig, which had died mysteriously the next day. In one particularly absurd case in Burgundy, A woman was accused of cursing an entire vineyard because she'd sneezed during the grape harvest. The fact that the harvest failed 2 months later was deemed proof of her guilt, rather than the more obvious explanation of disease vines. The legal proceedings against sneezers ranged from darkly comic to tragically brutal. Some towns instituted sneeze trials where the accused had to demonstrate their sneezes were natural by inhaling pepper under supervision. Others demanded sneezers prove their innocence by walking barefoot over hot coals. If God protected them from burns, clearly their sneezes were harmless. Most simply found themselves ostracized, their homes marked, their livelihoods destroyed by rumor alone. Jewish communities suffered particularly under this climate of suspicion. Already marginalized, they found themselves blamed for poisoning the air through their alleged sneezing practices. The fact that Jewish plague mortality rates were often lower, thanks to ritual washing traditions that provided accidental protection, only fueled the conspiracy theories. In city after city, the same horrific pattern repeated. A Christian would report seeing a Jew sneeze near a well. Mob violence would follow, and another scapegoat would be found for the unstoppable tide of death. The cruel irony was that sneezers were often the first victims, not the cause. Many of those accused had already contracted early stages of plague, their sneezes merely symptoms of their impending doom. They spent their last days not in bed surrounded by loved ones, but in makeshift plague prisons or at the end of a rope, their final breaths spent protesting their innocence between coughs. Even after death, the stigma lingered. In Marseille, officials refused to bury known sneezers in consecrated ground, tossing their bodies into plague pits without last rites. London saw cases of sneezers' homes being burned down for purification, with the owners still inside. The wealthier classes fared slightly better. They could afford to pay sneeze fines or bribe officials to ignore their nasal indiscretions. Money, as always, bought the privilege of bodily functions. By winter, the hysteria had reached such heights that some towns banned sneezing outright. Public notices declared it illegal to expel air violently through the nose in any public space, with punishments ranging from fines to public flogging. People developed elaborate techniques to stifle sneezes, pressing fingers under their noses, breathing through cloth, or simply running outside whenever they felt the telltale tickle. Some took to wearing bells to warn others of their approach, transforming themselves into walking leper colonies of the nasal variety. The truly tragic figures were those with chronic sneezing conditions. Hay fever sufferers became pariahs overnight. Came Bender, on Benidorm Wales. The man with the perennial cold found himself barred from the tavern. Even the village idiot whose loud sneezes had once been cause for laughter now found himself chased with stones. In their fear, people forgot basic humanity. A sneeze was no longer just a sneeze, but an existential threat. Perhaps the most telling detail of all comes from the records of a small French village where, during the height of the plague panic, a local priest noted in his journal, "Today we burned a sneezer. Tomorrow we shall see if God is appeased." The next day's entry reads simply, "More deaths. We must not have burned the right one." In the end, the scapegoating accomplished nothing except to add more suffering to an already unbearable time. The plague continued its march. The sneezes continued unchecked, and humanity proved once again that when faced with the incomprehensible, we'd rather light torches than look for answers. The real tragedy wasn't the sneezes. It was what they made us do to each other. Chapter 7. Quarantine. When they locked you in, the concept was simple in its cruelty. If one person showed signs of plague, everyone in the house would stay there until death came knocking or God proved merciful. This was quarantine, 14th century style. No careful isolation protocols, no medical supervision, just a boarded-up door and the grim arithmetic of waiting to see how many would be alive when the authority came back to check. The process began with the marking. A town official, usually wearing enough scented cloth around his face to qualify as a walking potpourri sack, would arrive with a pot of red paint or a length of white cloth. The chosen symbol varied by region: a red cross in England, a white X in France, a black circle in Germany. But the message was universal. Why death lives here? And once marked, the house became a tomb for the living. Windows were nailed shut with rough planks. Doors were barricaded from the outside. Sometimes, if the town was feeling generous, food would be left at the doorstep by neighbors using long poles to maintain a safe distance, as if delivering offerings to some capricious household god. The trigger for this domestic imprisonment could be as small as a single sneeze witnessed by the wrong person. A merchant's wife in Marseille spent her final days scratching at the inside of her sealed front door, because a neighbor swore she'd heard her sneeze twice while hanging laundry. A family of 7 in Coventry was boarded up because the youngest child had sneezed during Sunday Mass. Never mind that the boy had been fighting a cold for weeks. In Venice, where quarantine measures were most strictly enforced, officials kept detailed records of sneezes reported by citizen informants, turning every nasal twitch into potential evidence for house arrest. Inside these makeshift prisons, life took on a grotesque rhythm. Families would try to maintain normalcy. Meals were cooked, prayers were said, children were scolded, all while watching each other for the first signs of fever. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat and terror. Some households turned to desperate remedies, brewing questionable potions from whatever herbs they had stored away, or attempting to bleed themselves with kitchen knives. Others simply waited, marking the days on walls with charcoal, listening to the sounds of the town continuing without them. The sounds from neighboring quarantined houses told their own stories. At first, there would be voices, arguments, prayers, occasional singing, then coughing, then silence. The lucky ones died quickly. The unlucky ones had to listen as their relatives succumbed one by one, until they were left alone in the dark with corpses for company. Some towns sent plague cleaners to remove the dead, but these were often convicts or beggars pressed into service who would toss bodies into carts with the same enthusiasm one might show for moving rotten furniture. Attempts to escape were predictably brutal. In London, a man who broke through his boarded-up window was caught and hanged from his own roof beam as a warning to others. A woman in Paris managed to sneak out disguised as a corpse, only to be recognized days later by the distinctive cough she'd developed while in hiding. The punishment for escape attempts was usually public execution, not just for the offender, but often for their entire household. The message was clear: better to die quietly at home than to risk spreading death further. The psychological toll was unimaginable. Parents would watch their children for symptoms, praying they'd be spared while secretly calculating how much food would last if they had to start rationing. Neighbors who'd lived side by side for years would report each other for suspicious coughs, trading lives for the slim chance of saving their own. Some quarantined households turned to drinking whatever alcohol they had on hand, seeking oblivion as the walls closed in around them. Others became religious zealots overnight, turning their sealed homes into personal monasteries where every sneeze was interpreted as either divine punishment or demonic attack. Ironically, the quarantine measures did sometimes work, just not in the way authorities intended. By keeping infected households isolated, some towns did slow the spread of plague. But they also created countless unnecessary death sentences for families who might have only had common colds. The system was indiscriminate, catching the genuinely ill and the merely unfortunate in the same deadly net. The true horror lay in the randomness of it all. 2 houses could share a wall. One family healthy but quarantined because someone sneezed at market, the other actually infected but showing no symptoms yet. The healthy family would slowly starve behind their barricade, while the sick family went about their business, blissfully unaware they were already doomed. There was no science to it, only fear and crude guesswork dressed up as civic policy. By winter of 1349, many quarantined houses stood empty, some with their doors still sealed, the corpses inside frozen in grotesque tableaus of final moments. Towns began running out of wood for all the boarding up. The once feared plague marks on doors became so common they lost meaning, until entire streets looked like a gallery of death announcements. And through it all, people kept sneezing, because bodies, even in the worst of times, refused to stop being bodies. A reflex that normally warranted no more than a bless you could now condemn an entire family. The line between life and death had become as thin as a stray sunbeam, making someone's nose twitch at the wrong moment. Behind thousands of sealed doors across Europe, people learned a terrible lesson. Sometimes survival wasn't about avoiding disease, but about avoiding notice. In the end, quarantine didn't stop the plague. It simply gave the terror a structure, turning the great equalizer of disease into yet another system, where chance and cruelty decided who lived long enough to see the world after. The boarded-up houses stood as monuments to human desperation, not just to survive the plague, but to convince ourselves we could control it by controlling each other. The wood has long since rotted away, but the fear that built those barriers still lingers, waiting for the next time the world holds its breath. Chapter 8. The sneeze heard across the continent. Information traveled slowly in 1348, but panic moved at the speed of a galloping horse. While the Black Death crept from town to town at the pace of a rat-infested grain cart, stories about deadly sneezes raced ahead like heralds of doom. What began as isolated incidents of local hysteria soon snowballed into a continent-wide mythology of nasal betrayal, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. The process followed a predictable pattern. In a Lyon marketplace, a wool merchant might sneeze violently after inhaling dust from his wares. By the time the story reached Dijon, it would become a tale of 3 merchants who sneezed in unison before collapsing dead on the spot. By Paris, the number grew to 20, their sneezes so powerful they shattered nearby windows. By the time travelers brought the story to Calais, people spoke of entire market squares being felled by a single man's apocalyptic sneeze, his nasal explosion so potent it killed birds in flight. No one questioned how these stories grew in the telling. Fear had a way of sanding down rough edges and filling in gaps with whatever nightmare fuel lay closest to hand. The same peasants who would haggle ruthlessly over the price of eggs would accept the most outlandish sneeze stories without hesitation, provided they confirmed what everyone already believed, that the air itself had turned traitor. Rumors took on regional flavors as they spread. In Germany, sneezers were said to be working for the devil, their nasal outbursts deliberately spreading curses. Italian tales described aristocratic ladies whose delicate sneezes could wilt flowers at 30 paces. English accounts told of phantom sneezes, ghosts who wandered the countryside, sneezing plague into unwary travelers' faces. Each new variation reflected local fears while adding fresh layers to the growing mythology. The Church, never one to miss an opportunity to capitalize on terror, began incorporating sneezes into their sermons. A particularly creative monk in Avignon developed an entire eschatology around sneezing, claiming the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse would announce their arrival with world-shaking sneezes. Parishioners began crossing themselves after every sneeze, not as courtesy but as spiritual armor against the forces of darkness. Merchants quickly recognized the commercial potential of sneeze panic. Markets overflowed with anti-sneeze charms, dried frogs to carry in one's pocket, vials of saint's breath, ordinary air sold at extraordinary prices, and lead amulets engraved with prayers to Saint Sebastian, the patron saint of plague victims. One particularly enterprising apothecary in Toulouse sold sneeze-proof wax nose plugs that promised to filter corrupt air while making the wearer look like a demented boar. The medical establishment contributed its own brand of nonsense. A celebrated physician in Montpellier published a treatise claiming sneezes could be classified by their danger level. A dry sneeze signifies approaching fever, a wet sneeze foretells swelling of the glands, and a sneeze accompanied by a ringing in the ears indicates certain death within 3 days. His work was widely copied, despite the obvious fact that no one had ever heard a sneeze accompanied by ear ringing. As winter set in, the sneeze stories grew darker. Travelers told of entire villages where the inhabitants had sneezed themselves to death. A widely circulated account from Bohemia described a town where the sneezing grew so violent that victims' heads exploded. No one asked why. If this were true, the storyteller had survived to report it. Credulity had become a survival skill. Better to believe 10 impossible things than risk missing one true warning. The rumors created bizarre new social norms. In some towns, people took to announcing "I'm about to sneeze" in loud voices before doing so, giving others time to flee. Others developed elaborate sneezing etiquette, turning away from companions and sneezing into specially prepared sneeze sacks filled with herbs. The wealthy constructed sneezing parlors in their homes, small, ventilated rooms where one could sneeze in relative privacy without alarming the servants. Language itself shifted to accommodate the new reality. The old "blessing God help you" after sneezes became more urgent, often repeated multiple times like a protective incantation. Some regions developed special sneeze alarms, bells rung after a sneeze to warn neighbors. In particularly superstitious areas, people began referring to sneezes indirectly as the nose's betrayal or the breath's rebellion, as if saying the word itself might summon disaster. All this hysteria occurred against the backdrop of very real suffering. While people obsessed over phantom sneezers, actual plague victims died in droves, their bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. The disconnect between imagined and real dangers became increasingly grotesque. A man might spend hours boiling his clothes to purify them from imagined sneeze contamination, then drink from a contaminated well without a second thought. By spring of 1349, the sneeze panic had taken on a life of its own, spreading to areas the plague hadn't even reached yet. Isolated mountain villages that had seen no illness became convinced their occasional sneezes meant doom was imminent. Some communities preemptively boarded up houses where sneezes had been heard, condemning healthy families to starve in anticipation of a plague that never came. The cruel irony was that all this energy directed at sneezes did nothing to stop the actual plague. The real vectors, rats and fleas, continued their work unmolested while humans obsessed over the wrong threat. In their desperation for control, people had latched onto something visible and immediate, something they could theoretically guard against, even if their precautions were as useful as crossing one's fingers. What began as reasonable, if misguided, concern about disease transmission had spiraled into full-blown mass delusion. The sneeze had become more than a bodily function. It was a symbol, a scapegoat, a blank screen onto which a terrified population projected all its amorphous dread. And like the plague itself, this particular madness showed no signs of slowing as it continued its march across the medieval mind. Chapter 9. Cures worse than the disease. Desperation makes for terrible medicine. As the Black Death tightened its grip on Europe, the collective war against sneezing spawned an industry of remedies ranging from the useless to the actively harmful. Medieval pharmacology operated on one unshakable principle. If something couldn't possibly work, someone would insist it was miraculous. Take the case of leeches applied to the nose. This particular stroke of genius came from the observation that sneezing involved the head. Therefore, the head must contain too much blood. The solution? Drain it, of course. Wealthy patients paid physicians to attach the slimy little bloodsuckers directly to their nostrils, where they would dangle like grotesque nasal jewelry until sufficiently engorged. The treatment achieved exactly two things. It made sneezing even more uncomfortable, and gave the plague a convenient new entry point through the open wounds left behind. For those who couldn't afford leeches, or had the good sense to avoid them, there was always powdered unicorn horn. Never mind that unicorns didn't exist. Apothecaries happily sold narwhal tusks or carved cattle bones at exorbitant prices. The instructions were simple. Snort the powder like a nobleman at a feast, then wait for the magic to happen. What actually happened was a spectacular increase in nosebleeds and several documented cases of suffocation when the powder clumped in sinuses. But At least those victims died without sneezing again. The truly committed could try the hot poker inhalation method, championed by a particularly deranged physician in Toulouse. The theory was that superheated air would cauterize the sneeze reflex right out of a person's nasal passages. Patients would lean over a brazier while the doctor thrust a red-hot iron into the coals beneath them, creating a blast of searing air to inhale. Those who didn't pass out from the pain often found their ability to smell and occasionally breathe permanently damaged. But as the doctor proudly noted in his ledgers, none of his patients ever complained of sneezing again. Herbal remedies abounded, each more imaginative than the last. Some swore by stuffing their nostrils with moldy bread, inspired by the logic that if mold could grow anywhere, it must be strong enough to fight disease. Others carried pomanders of rotting meat around their necks, the theory being that the worse something smelled, the more it would repel bad air. A thriving trade developed in plague flowers, ordinary blossoms sold at extraordinary prices after being blessed by monks who may or may not have first sneezed on them. The church offered its own spiritual solutions. Pilgrims flocked to shrines where saints were said to cure sneezers, though the process often involved more walking than miracles. Some parishes sold holy sneeze water, ordinary well water that had been prayed over, then marked up several $100. Particularly devout sufferers could purchase indulgences specifically for sneezing, essentially paying the church to forgive their nostrils for betraying them. For the aristocratic class, remedies became increasingly elaborate and absurd. The Duke of Burgundy's physician prescribed a regimen of gold leaf snorted daily, which did wonders for the Duke's nasal passages, and even better things for the physician's retirement fund. Italian nobility favored enemas of vintage wine mixed with crushed pearls, based on the theory that what cured melancholy might also cure sneezing. The only verifiable result was a generation of nobles who walked funny and smelled like a vineyard's trash bin. Common folk made do with what they had. Old wives' tales recommended holding one's breath until fainting, eating a spiderweb a day, or drinking one's own urine, though whether this was meant to stop sneezes or simply make one forget about them remains unclear. Some villages practiced sneeze transfers, where the afflicted would touch a tree then run away before the sneezes could follow them. A method that worked perfectly until someone noticed the trees weren't actually sneezing. The medical texts of the period read like a catalog of horrors. One recommended treatment involved bleeding a patient from the forehead while making them inhale burning feathers. Another suggested rubbing the nose with mercury until it bled, then packing the nostrils with salt. The more creative physicians prescribed sympathetic cures, like carrying a dried toad in one's pocket, or sleeping with a piece of silver under the tongue. Perhaps the most telling cure came from England, where a cunning man named Geoffrey of Essex sold demon traps to place under pillows. These intricately carved boxes supposedly caught the demons that caused sneezing during the night. Geoffrey became wealthy enough to retire, though not before accidentally inhaling one of his own traps during a sneezing fit. A fitting end for a man who built his fortune on nonsense. What none of these remedies accounted for was the simple fact that sneezing is a reflex, not a disease. The medieval mind, so adept at pattern recognition, kept seeing connections where none existed. If a patient stopped sneezing after a treatment, it was proof the remedy worked. Never mind that people often stopped sneezing naturally, or that many cured patients died of plague days later. Confirmation bias became the real pandemic, spreading from town to town faster than any disease. By the height of the plague years, the quest to stop sneezing had become its own kind of madness. People lathered their faces with rancid butter, inserted hot needles into their nasal cavities, and drank potions containing everything from crushed emeralds to dried frog semen. The wealthiest could afford entire regimens of pointless treatments. Bleeding on Monday, leeches on Tuesday, mercury snorting on Wednesday, while the poor made do with whatever dangerous nonsense they could scrape together. In the end, the only thing these cures reliably treated was common sense. They provided the illusion of control in a world spinning rapidly into chaos, a way to fight back against an enemy that couldn't be seen or understood. That they accomplished nothing except separating fools from their money, and occasionally their lives, mattered less than the comfort of doing something, anything, in the face of the unknown. The real miracle wasn't that any of these treatments worked. It was that anyone survived them long enough to die of plague instead. Chapter 10. The Funeral Business Boom. Death had always been a reliable employer, but 1348 offered the sort of career opportunities that made even the most ambitious gravedigger blush. As the plague swept through Europe with the enthusiasm of a drunk nobleman at a peasant wedding, the death trade experienced an unprecedented boom. Funeral directors, who had once struggled to bury a dozen bodies a month, now found themselves turning away business. Gravediggers who could barely afford shoes in January were wearing fine leather boots by autumn. The Black Death, for all its horrors, was the best thing to happen to the funeral industry since the invention of the shovel. The mathematics were simple and grim. A single sneeze could empty a house. A cough in the marketplace could depopulate a street. Every involuntary bodily function became a potential job creator for the men who dealt in final arrangements. Where other professions crumbled under the weight of loss, mortuary services flourished like mushrooms on a rotten log. Churches that had once buried parishioners with solemn dignity now functioned as spiritual assembly lines, priests mumbling last rites over mass graves, before rushing off to the next batch of soon-to-be corpses. The newly wealthy death merchants developed pretensions. Simple wooden coffins gave way to elaborate plague boxes with velvet linings and iron reinforcements to protect against miasmatic seepage and justify tripling the price. Gravediggers unionized, demanding hazard pay for handling infected bodies. In London, a group of enterprising corpse collectors formed a cartel, artificially limiting the number of daily burials to drive up prices. Their scheme worked beautifully until they all died of plague themselves, proving that even in death the free market finds a way. Undertakers became the unlikely celebrities of the plague years. The most successful ones developed recognizable brands. Thomas Deep Dig O'Leary in Dublin became famous for his 6-foot graves. No corpse ever crawled out of a Tommy Deep dig. While in Marseille, Pierre the Swift Lavoie guaranteed same-day burial or your money back. Not that anyone ever came back to collect. These men walked with the swagger of bankers, their pockets heavy with coins from grieving families who just wanted grandma underground before she started smelling. The burial business spawned all manner of supporting industries. Coffin makers worked around the clock, eventually simplifying their designs to little more than nailed-together planks to meet demand. Mourners for hire appeared in market squares, offering professional wailing services by the hour. A particularly shameless merchant in Venice sold plague insurance. Pay up front and get guaranteed burial in consecrated ground, though the fine print revealed this only applied if you died on a Tuesday during a full moon while facing east. The wealthy, as always, found ways to make even death a competition. Rich families feed for increasingly elaborate funerary monuments, commissioning statues and chapels while the bodies were still warm. A Florentine banker had his plague-stricken son interred in a marble tomb engraved with scenes from his short life, including one suspiciously detailed bas-relief of the boy sneezing at his last birthday party. The middle classes made do with whatever they could afford, which often meant sharing graves with strangers in what became known as eternal neighbor arrangements. The poor, as usual, went into pits by the cartload, their final resting places marked only by quicklime and the boot prints of the men who dumped them there. The churchyards filled first, then the vacant lots, then the basements of abandoned houses. Creative solutions emerged when space ran out. Cellars became catacombs, moats became mass graves, and in one particularly desperate French village, the local bakery's oven was repurposed for cremations, though the owner insisted on removing the bodies before the bread went in. In Avignon, where the papal court found itself overwhelmed by corpses, they simply threw bodies into the Rhone River until the downstream towns complained about the drinking water tasting like death. The funeral industry's boom came with its own specialized vocabulary. A sneeze and drop referred to someone who died within hours of their first symptom. Back work meant handling the oozier corpses. Sans Luck described a gravedigger who hadn't caught plague yet. The most coveted workers were those who had survived the disease, and were thus presumed immune. They could command triple wages, though their tendency to still cough occasionally made clients nervous. Perhaps the most bizarre development was the rise of preventative funerals. Wealthy families, terrified of dying unprepared, began commissioning their own tombs and writing elaborate funeral instructions years in advance. A paranoid count in Normandy went so far as to stage his own funeral, while still healthy, lying in his coffin as priests performed the rites, just to make sure everything was done properly. He survived the ceremony only to die of plague 3 days later, at which point his servants discovered he'd forgotten to specify where the actual grave should be dug. As the death toll mounted, the business of burial became increasingly impersonal. What had once been sacred rituals devolved into logistical challenges. In London, the Bishop of Rochester complained that gravediggers were singing drinking songs while they worked, and that one particularly enterprising crew had started taking bets on how many bodies they could inter before sundown. The church attempted to maintain decorum, but even priests grew numb, reciting last rites with the enthusiasm of bored schoolchildren counting peas on their plates. By the peak of the plague years, the funeral trade had become a well-oiled machine of mortality. Supply chains developed for everything from holy water to burial shrouds. Apprentice programs sprang up to train new gravediggers, though the turnover remained high for obvious reasons. The most successful undertakers diversified their portfolios, investing in linen production for shrouds, candle making for vigil lights, and wine importation for themselves. The irony was thick enough to choke on. While doctors and priests and nobles all claimed to be fighting the plague, the only people actually prospering were those dealing with its consequences. The gravediggers and coffin makers became the accidental capitalists of the apocalypse, their fortunes rising in direct proportion to everyone else's misery. They built fine houses, married their children into respectable families, and generally lived like kings, right up until the plague came for them too. In the end, the funeral boom went bust like everything else. As populations dwindled, so did the demand for burials. The once busy gravediggers found themselves with time on their hands, their expensive tools gathering rust. The elaborate funeral monuments stood as silent reminders of a time when death had been good for business. And the pits full of anonymous bodies slowly sank into the earth, their occupants forever unaware of the economic boom they'd inspired. The plague taught many lessons about mortality and human nature, but perhaps the most cynical was this: in the right circumstances, even the end of the world can be profitable, provided you don't mind getting your hands dirty. Chapter 11. Saints and Sneeze Relics. The medieval relic trade had always operated on a flexible relationship with truth, but the plague years sent it into full-blown fantasy. As sneezing became the ultimate harbinger of doom, enterprising clergy and outright frauds alike scrambled to meet the demand for divine nasal protection. What emerged was a thriving market for sacred objects that promised to ward off sneezes, cure the sniffles, and generally keep one's nostrils on God's good side. At the Abbey of Saint-Médard in Paris, monks discovered a scrap of cloth allegedly used by Saint Genevieve to blow her nose during a particularly miraculous 5th century sneezing fit. The relic, displayed in an ornate golden reliquary shaped like a nasal cavity, drew pilgrims from across France. Wealthy patrons paid handsomely for the privilege of pressing the cloth to their faces, while peasants contented themselves with touching small pieces of fabric to the main relic to create secondary blessed hankies. The fact that the original cloth had been replaced 3 times due to overhandling never seemed to dampen enthusiasm. Venice's Basilica di San Marco outdid everyone by claiming to possess not 1 but 12 of St. Mark's nose hairs, each individually mounted in crystal vials. Pilgrims could purchase vials of holy sneeze water that had allegedly touched the relics, though the canny priests never specified which saint had supposedly sneezed into it. The cathedral's records show they sold nearly 6,000 vials in a single month, at prices that would make modern pharmaceutical companies blush. The relic craze reached its zenith with the infamous Holy Sternutation collection in Cologne, where a particularly creative priest assembled an entire exhibition dedicated to saints and sneezing. Visitors could view a vial of air exhaled by St. Ursula during a blessed sneeze, a bone fragment from a martyr who supposedly died mid-sneeze, and a piece of wood claimed to be from the manger that made the infant Jesus sneeze. The collection's centerpiece was a dried flower that had allegedly been sneezed upon by 3 different saints on 3 separate occasions, making it the spiritual equivalent of a nasal nuclear deterrent. Not to be outdone, English churches began promoting their own sneeze-related relics. Canterbury Cathedral claimed to possess a handkerchief used by Thomas Becket to cover a sneeze moments before his martyrdom. Never mind that no historical account mentioned this. York Minster displayed a feather from a pillow that had caught a saintly sneeze. Smaller parishes made do with fragments of wood from saints' childhood beds, on the theory that everyone sneezes in their sleep eventually. The production of new relics became an industry unto itself. A thriving black market emerged for items that had been accidentally touched to real relics, creating an endless supply of secondary and tertiary holy objects. Unscrupulous merchants sold ordinary chicken bones as sneeze bones of minor martyrs. One particularly shameless dealer in Florence was caught selling cat fur as angel's sneeze fluff, though his customers only complained when the relics started moving in their pouches. The wealthy commissioned personalized relics to ensure exclusive heavenly protection. A Milanese noblewoman paid a small fortune for a jewel-encrusted box containing a breath of St. Ambrose, collected by holding a mirror to the saint's face during a sneeze 4 centuries after his death. The Doge of Venice wore an amulet containing dust from the tomb of St. Mark, which he would sniff vigorously whenever someone nearby sneezed. French King Philip VI allegedly slept with a relic under his pillow that was claimed to be a piece of the true sneeze, the very handkerchief used by the Virgin Mary to cover young Jesus' nose. The ecclesiastical establishment, while initially skeptical, quickly recognized the financial potential. Popes began issuing special indulgences for those who venerated sneeze relics. The Bishop of Mainz declared that 3 Hail Marys said while holding a sneeze relic counted as a full confession. In Rome, a thriving side business developed where priests would bless parishioners' handkerchiefs by sneezing on them personally, for a modest donation, of course. The relics spawned their own mythology. Stories circulated of miraculous sneezes that had cured the sick or predicted the future. A popular tale told of a monk whose relic-induced sneeze correctly forecast the weather for an entire season. Another claimed that a single sneeze from a particularly holy abbot had driven away a plague cloud hovering over his monastery. The more outlandish the story, the more revered the relic became. Scientific minds of the era tried to push back against the relic frenzy. Physician Guy de Chauliac famously wrote that 100 sneezes into a handkerchief does not make it holy, only damp, though his treatise was widely ignored. At the University of Paris, a debate raged over whether angelic sneezes could transmit grace, with one theologian seriously arguing that seraphim must sneeze in triplicate to maintain the Holy Trinity's nasal equilibrium. The sneeze relic craze only began to wane when the plague itself did. As mortality rates dropped, so did demand for miraculous nasal protection. Many relics were quietly retired from display, though some found new life as general plague protections. The Cologne collection's famed triple sneezed flower was later rebranded as a cure for gout, then indigestion, before finally being lost during a particularly rowdy church auction in 1402. What lingers from this bizarre episode is not just the absurdity, but what it reveals about human nature in crisis. Faced with an invisible, unstoppable threat, people clung to whatever promised safety, even if it was a piece of cloth sneezed on by someone dead for 8 centuries. The relics didn't work, of course, But in a world where a single sneeze could mean death, perhaps the real miracle was the ability to believe in anything at all. In the end, the only thing these relics truly preserved was the medieval talent for turning desperation into commerce. Today, the few remaining Holy Sneeze artifacts gather dust in church vaults and museum backrooms, silent witnesses to a time when faith, fear, and nasal secretions collided in the most peculiar of devotions. Chapter 12. The Last Sneeze. The village of Saint-Éternu had never produced anyone of consequence until the plague came. It wasn't even a proper village, just a cluster of thatched huts squatting stubbornly beside a river that frequently forgot where its banks were supposed to be. The place got its name from a local legend about a shepherd who sneezed so hard an angel came to investigate, though more skeptical visitors suggested it was because the local cheese tended to make visitors sneeze violently. Then came the spring of 1349, and with it Jehan the Tanner, the only man in history to have his entire legacy reduced to a single nasal eruption. Jehan wasn't special. He tanned hides with middling skill, drank ale with moderate enthusiasm, and remembered saints' days just well enough to avoid his wife's wrath. His sneezes were similarly unremarkable. Neither thunderous explosions nor delicate chirps, just the ordinary hachoo of a man whose nose had endured decades of leather fumes and river damp, until the day it became his epitaph. It happened at high noon on what would have been an utterly forgettable Tuesday. Jehan stood in the marketplace, haggling over a side of particularly pungent goatskin, when he felt that familiar tickle. Later accounts would claim the air itself grew still in anticipation, that birds ceased their singing, that the village dogs all turned their heads in unison. In reality, the baker's son was probably picking his nose nearby, and a chicken definitely defecated on the cobblestones at the exact moment Jehan inhaled sharply through his increasingly irritated nostrils. The sneeze itself was nothing extraordinary. Slightly wetter than usual, perhaps, with that faint whistling note Jehan's wife had mockingly compared to a tea kettle for 20 years. But in the plague-haunted silence of Saint-Éternu in 1349, it might as well have been the trump of doom. Every eye in the marketplace locked onto Jehan. The goatskin merchant took 3 rapid steps backward, nearly impaling himself on a nearby rake. The baker's wife made the sign of the cross with such vigor she nearly poked out her own eye. Even the usually oblivious village priest suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, his robes flapping like a startled crow's wings as he fled. Because everyone knew what came after the sneeze. Jehan knew, too. He'd seen it play out a dozen times already that terrible year. The suspicious looks, the hushed whispers, the gradual exile from human company. He opened his mouth to explain that it was just the damned goatskin smell, that he felt fine, that his joints weren't even achy today, then sneezed again. This second sneeze had an audience. The first had drawn attention, but the second pinned it down like a butterfly to a board. By the time the third sneeze arrived, a real showstopper with impressive nasal resonance, the marketplace had emptied with the efficiency of rats abandoning a sinking ship. Only the goat skin remained, abandoned on the counter along with Jehan's payment, the first known case of a medieval merchant preferring financial loss over potential plague exposure. Jehan's walk home became a perverse sort of procession. Neighbors darted into doorways as he passed. Children were yanked indoors by frantic mothers. Old Guillaume the shepherd, who everyone knew had been pissing blood for a month, actually threw a clod of dirt at him from what he clearly considered a safe distance. By nightfall, the village council had convened an emergency meeting in the church. Their solution was the standard one for 1349. Jehan and his entire family would be confined to their home until either the danger passed or they all died, the latter being statistically more likely. They nailed the door shut at dawn. The first day, Jehan's wife cursed him thoroughly between her own sneezes. The second day, their youngest daughter developed a fever. The third day, they all stopped counting. What's remarkable isn't how Jehan died. the plague being notoriously egalitarian in its methods, but how he lived on afterward. Because while the village elders had been busy condemning Jehan's household, the village gossips had been perfecting the story of the sneeze. With each retelling, it grew grander. The marketplace became an arena. The goatskin transformed into a deadly omen. Jehan's ordinary nasal outburst became a seismic event that shook church bells in their towers 3 villages away. By midsummer, travelers were telling stories about the legendary sneeze of Saint-Étonnue in taverns as far as Lyon. When the surviving villagers finally unsealed Jehan's cottage months later, finding exactly what one would expect, they debated what to do with the remains. Burial in consecrated ground seemed risky given the circumstances. Burning might spread the miasma. In the end, they settled on the medieval solution to all uncomfortable problems. They put up a sign. The crude wooden marker bore only 3 words: "Here lies Sneeze." It should have ended there. But Jehan's sneeze had taken on a life of its own. Pilgrims began visiting the grave, convinced that the earth where a plague victim fell held special power. Some claimed rubbing dirt from the site on their chests cured coughs. Others swore it induced prophetic dreams, though these usually just involved sneezing. By 1352, the village elders, never ones to miss a financial opportunity, were selling little bags of sneeze soil to visitors. Today, only a weathered stone remains where Jehan's cottage once stood. The inscription is worn down to just the word sneeze, which local children insist will make you sneeze if you say it aloud 3 times while standing on the spot. The legend lives on in the village name, now ironically known for its annual festival of allergies each spring. As for Jehan, he became what few medieval peasants ever achieve: unforgettable. Not for his deeds, his character, or his accomplishments, but for a single reflexive expulsion of air through his nose at an inopportune historical moment. His entire existence reduced to a bodily function, his legacy measured in nasal decibels. In the end, we all become stories. Jehan's just happened to be a sneeze. And perhaps there's a lesson in that, about how history remembers us, about the fragile nature of legacy, or maybe just about keeping your handkerchief handy during plague season. Chapter 13. Legacy of the Plague Sneeze. The Black Death eventually receded, but the terror of sneezing lingered like a bad smell in a closed room. Long after the last plague pits were filled, people still flinched at nasal outbursts, still muttered blessings under their breath, still eyed strangers' nostrils with quiet suspicion. The pandemic ended. The paranoia did not. The most obvious relic was the phrase, "Gig bless you." Once a genuine prayer for divine intervention, now reduced to polite reflex. What had begun as a desperate attempt to ward off evil spirits clinging to expelled breath became, over generations, a social nicety as automatic as a handshake. By the 16th century, failure to bless a sneeze was considered as rude as spitting in church, though considerably less hygienic. The Dutch took it a step further, adding gezondheid, health, as a secondary blessing if someone sneezed twice, a tradition that suggested God might need reminding after the first attempt failed. Wealthy households developed elaborate sneezing protocols. A French etiquette manual from 1583 devoted an entire chapter to the proper management of nasal explosions, which included turning away from companions, stifling the sound into a jeweled handkerchief, and immediately burning said handkerchief afterward, a rule more often ignored than followed. Italian nobility took to carrying decorative sneeze guards, small, perforated screens of silver or ivory that could be raised at a moment's notice, like personal drawbridges against airborne assault. The medical profession, never one to abandon a good misconception, continued blaming sneezes for everything from gout to bad harvests well into the 17th century. Physicians prescribed nose plugs for chronic sneezers and advised covering one's face when passing cemeteries, lest the miasma of the dead trigger an unfortunate expulsion. One German doctor, writing in 1620, insisted that suppressing a sneeze could cause humors to retreat into the brain, inducing madness, an idea that explained much about European politics of the era. Churches maintained their own peculiar traditions. Some parishes kept sneeze logs, recording congregants who sneezed during Mass, on the assumption that these outbursts might later prove useful for tracking disease outbreaks. Others sold sneeze indulgences, small scraps of parchment promising reduced time in purgatory for those who sneezed piously. A monastery in Austria famously housed a relic claimed to be a handkerchief used by Saint Boniface to smother a demon that had leapt out of a possessed man's nose during a particularly violent sneeze. Pilgrims could purchase vials of salt that had allegedly touched the cloth, to be snorted at the first sign of nasal rebellion. The working classes, as always, adapted with less ceremony, but more creativity. Market vendors developed coded signals to warn of nearby sneezers. A tapped cane meant a sneeze had been heard upwind, while a turned-back hat indicated it was time to leave. Millers added sneeze guards to their flour sacks, not for hygiene, but because customers refused to buy anything that might have been contaminated by a cough or sneeze. Even the lowly tavern brawl evolved new rules. Striking a man for sneezing near your drink was considered justified in most European courts until at least 1650. The plague's shadow stretched all the way to the New World, where Puritan colonists blamed sneezes on demonic influence. Cotton Mather's diaries contain no fewer than 17 accounts of Satan's nasal provocations among the godly, including one poor woman whose hay fever was nearly tried as witchcraft. The Jamestown settlers, ever practical, simply shot a man who sneezed 3 times in succession, on the sensible theory that it was better to be safe than sorry. Art and literature preserved the sneeze's grim reputation long after medicine had moved on. Shakespeare gave ominous sneezes to doomed characters. Caesar sneezes before his murder in Julius Caesar, though history fails to corroborate this. Dutch still-life paintings of the 1600s often included a skull next to a handkerchief, a not-so-subtle memento mori for those who expelled breath too carelessly. Even children's rhymes warned of the dangers. Sneeze once, fear a pain. Sneeze twice. Fear a rain, sneeze thrice. Fear the grave again. And the turning point came, as many bad ideas do, from the French. By the 18th century, Parisian doctors had begun questioning whether sneezes were truly deadly or just terribly rude. The fashionable elite, always eager for new ways to distinguish themselves from the common sniffles of the peasantry, embraced the radical notion that sneezing was merely embarrassing, not lethal. Voltaire famously mocked the old superstitions in a 1733 essay, asking why no one blessed people who farted, given that both were equal expulsions of nature. Predictably, the Church condemned this comparison as heresy. Yet old fears die harder than plague victims. As late as 1890, a London man successfully sued his neighbor for reckless sneezing, after catching cold following an alleged nasal assault. The judge, displaying the legal acumen that made Britain great, awarded damages of 1 shilling, enough to buy a handkerchief, but not enough to stop the defendant from sneezing again. Today, we know better. We know sneezes are just reflexes, that the plague traveled on fleas, that covering one's mouth is about politeness, not survival. And yet, how quickly, in the right circumstances, the old terror returns. How instinctively we still turn away when a stranger sneezes on the bus. How we hesitate before shaking the hand of someone who sniffles. The words, "God bless you," still escape our lips before we can think. A 6th-century-old spell against death we can't quite stop reciting. The plague taught Europe many things, about public health, about societal collapse, about how very fragile civilization really is. But its quietest, most persistent lesson was this. Once a thing becomes associated with death, no amount of reason can entirely scrub the stain away. We bless sneezes not because we still believe in miasma, but because somewhere deep in our bones, we remember a time when that reflex might have been the last sound someone ever made. So the next time someone sneezes, and you automatically say, "Bless you," remember, you're not just being polite. You're participating in a 700-year-old exorcism. Somewhere, Jehan the Tanner is nodding in approval.